The mountain wind carried Dorothy Collins's trembling voice across the settlement as she stood before the gathered crowd, her weathered hands clutching a faded wedding dress that had yellowed with years of waiting. Stephen Turner's massive frame towered beside her, his calloused finger pointing directly at her, with unmistakable pride, as his deep voice boomed over the murmurs of disbelief. "She's my wife," he declared, his words cutting through decades of rejection and whispered cruelties like an axe through kindling. The same people who had called her too old, too plain, too set in her ways now stared in stunned silence as this legendary figure of the mountains claimed her as his own. Dorothy felt something break open in her chest, not with pain this time, but with a fierce joy she had never dared to imagine possible. But this moment of triumph had been born from years of quiet suffering that began long before Stephen Turner ever set foot in Cedar Falls. Dorothy had arrived in the frontier town 15 years earlier, a young woman of 22 with hopeful eyes and a heart full of dreams about finding love in the untamed wilderness. The wagon train that brought her west had been filled with families seeking new beginnings, and she had imagined herself among the first to find a husband among the hard-working men who were carving civilization from the raw landscape. Those early years had been filled with Sunday socials and church gatherings where she would smooth her best dress and arrange her auburn hair just so, hoping to catch the eye of one of the eligible bachelors. She had been pretty then, with smooth skin and a quick smile, but something about her had always seemed to put men off. Perhaps it was her tendency to speak her mind, or the way she could read and write better than most of the men in town. Maybe it was her insistence on discussing books and ideas rather than just household matters. Whatever the reason, one by one, the other young women who had arrived with her found husbands while Dorothy remained alone. The town of Cedar Falls had watched her transform from a hopeful young bride into what they whispered about as an old maid. By 30, the invitations to social gatherings had dwindled. By 35, people spoke to her with the pitying tone reserved for those who had missed their chance at happiness. Now, at 37, she had become invisible to most of the town's residents, existing on the margins of a community that valued women primarily for their ability to bear children and tend to households. Dorothy supported herself by taking in sewing and mending, her skilled fingers working late into the night by lamplight to earn enough coins to pay for her small room above the general store. The work was steady but lonely, and she often found herself wondering what her life might have been if she had stayed back east, where her sharp mind and independent spirit might have been less of a hindrance to finding companionship. But she had made her choice to come west, and she was determined to make the best of the life she had built, even if it wasn't the life she had dreamed of. The whispers followed her everywhere she went in Cedar Falls. At the Mercantile, women would pause their conversations when she approached, resuming them in hushed tones after she passed. Children influenced by their parents' attitudes sometimes giggled and pointed when they saw her walking down the dusty main street with her basket of mending. The cruelest comments came from the younger women who had married soon after arriving in town, as if Dorothy's single status somehow threatened their own security. Martha Perez, who ran the boarding house, was one of the few people who treated Dorothy with genuine kindness. She would often invite Dorothy for tea and conversation, providing a rare respite from the isolation that had become Dorothy's constant companion. It was during one of these visits that Martha first mentioned the mountain man who occasionally came down from the high country to trade for supplies. "He's a strange one," Martha had said, stirring honey into her tea. "Stephen Turner, they call him. Lives up in the mountains somewhere. Nobody knows exactly where. Comes to town maybe twice a year, trades furs and meat for what he needs, then disappears again. Some folks say he's been up there for near on 20 years, ever since he came back from the war. Others claim he's half wild by now, more comfortable with bears and wolves than with civilized people." Dorothy had listened with polite interest, but she hadn't given the mountain man much thought. Her concerns were more immediate, focused on the dwindling pile of mending work and the growing difficulty of making ends meet. The town was changing as more families arrived and established themselves. The newer residents brought their own seamstresses and had their own social circles that didn't include the aging spinster who lived above the general store. As autumn approached, Dorothy found herself facing a crisis that threatened to upend the precarious stability she had managed to maintain. Wayne Hall, who owned the general store, informed her that he would be needing her room for his expanding family. His wife Patricia was expecting their fourth child, and they required the additional space. He offered Dorothy a month to find alternative arrangements, delivered with the apologetic but firm tone of a man who felt bad about the situation but wasn't willing to change his mind. The news hit Dorothy like a physical blow. There were no other rooms for rent in Cedar Falls, and she certainly couldn't afford to purchase property of her own. The boarding house was full, and Martha had no additional space to offer. As Dorothy sat in her small room that evening, surrounded by the few possessions she had accumulated over the years, she felt the walls of her carefully constructed life closing in around her. Sleep eluded her that night as she lay staring at the ceiling, trying to formulate a plan that would keep her from becoming completely destitute. She could try to find work as a housekeeper for one of the wealthier families, but most of them already had help and weren't looking to take on additional staff. She could attempt to travel to another town, but she had no money for passage and no guarantee of finding better circumstances elsewhere. The next morning brought an early frost that painted the windows with delicate ice crystals, a harbinger of the harsh winter that was approaching. Dorothy dressed carefully in her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had sewn herself years earlier, and made her way downstairs to help Wayne with the morning customers. She hoped that by making herself especially useful, she might be able to negotiate a few more weeks to find alternative arrangements. The store was busier than usual, with townspeople stocking up on supplies before the weather turned truly cold. Dorothy worked efficiently, helping customers find what they needed and keeping track of accounts with her neat handwriting. It was while she was organizing bolts of fabric that she first saw Stephen Turner. He filled the doorway like a force of nature, his massive shoulders nearly brushing the frame as he entered. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskins that had been darkened by weather and wear, and his boots were the heavy kind made for traversing rough mountain terrain. But it was his eyes that caught Dorothy's attention, pale blue and startlingly intelligent, taking in everything around him with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to reading his environment for signs of danger. The conversation in the store died as Stephen Turner made his way to the counter where Wayne Hall waited with barely concealed nervousness. The mountain man moved with surprising grace for someone of his size, his footsteps silent despite his heavy boots. He carried a large pack over one shoulder and had a rifle slung across his back, both practical necessities for someone who lived in the wilderness, but intimidating to the town dwellers who rarely saw such raw displays of frontier capability. Stephen's voice, when he finally spoke, was deeper than Dorothy had expected and roughened by years of limited use. He needed basic supplies, he told Wayne, rattling off a list that included flour, coffee, salt, and ammunition. His manner was direct and efficient, with none of the small talk that usually accompanied transactions in the store. He seemed eager to complete his business and return to wherever he had come from. Dorothy found herself studying him covertly as she continued her work, fascinated by this legendary figure who had finally materialized before her eyes. There was something about his careful movements and watchful demeanor that suggested a man who had learned to be completely self-reliant. She wondered what circumstances had driven him to choose such an isolated existence, and whether he ever felt the loneliness that had become her constant companion. As Wayne gathered the requested items, Stephen's gaze wandered around the store, taking inventory of the changes that had occurred since his last visit. His eyes lingered on Dorothy for a moment, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she pretended to be absorbed in her fabric sorting. When their eyes met briefly, she was surprised to see no judgment or dismissal in his expression, just a quiet curiosity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The transaction was completed quickly, with Stephen paying in gold coins that gleamed dully in the morning light streaming through the store windows. He shouldered his pack and turned to leave, but paused at the door when Wayne called after him with forced joviality about the approaching winter. Stephen's response was characteristically brief, mentioning that the signs pointed to an early and harsh season before he disappeared into the street. Dorothy watched through the window as he loaded his supplies onto a sturdy pack mule and led the animal toward the edge of town. Within minutes, he had vanished into the tree line as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of wood smoke and pine that had clung to his clothing. The encounter stayed with Dorothy throughout the day, providing a welcome distraction from her housing crisis. There had been something almost mythical about Stephen Turner's presence, as if a character from one of the adventure novels she sometimes read had stepped into the mundane reality of her daily life. She found herself wondering about his solitary existence in the mountains, imagining the cabin where he must live, and the daily routines that structured his isolated life. That evening, as she sat mending a torn shirt by lamplight, Dorothy allowed herself to indulge in fantasies about what it might be like to live free from the constant scrutiny and judgment of town life. The idea of existing beyond the reach of whispered comments and pitying looks held an appeal that surprised her with its intensity. She had always assumed that civilization, however imperfect, was preferable to the dangers and hardships of wilderness living. But Stephen Turner's quiet confidence had planted seeds of doubt about that assumption. The next few days passed in a blur of increasingly desperate attempts to secure housing. Dorothy approached every family in town that might have need of a housekeeper or seamstress, but found no takers. The few offers she received were insulting in their terms, clearly taking advantage of her vulnerable position. She began to realize that her years of independence had earned her a reputation as someone who was difficult to manage, making potential employers reluctant to take her on. As her deadline approached, Dorothy found herself walking the streets of Cedar Falls at odd hours, trying to think of solutions that seemed increasingly unlikely to materialize. It was during one of these wandering sessions that she encountered Brian Price, a recent widower whose wife had died in childbirth the previous spring. Brian was a decent man, hardworking and kind, but he was struggling to manage his farm and care for his two young children without assistance. Brian Price approached Dorothy outside the church after Sunday service, his hat in his hands and his expression earnest but uncomfortable. He had heard about her housing situation, he explained, and wondered if she might consider a practical arrangement that would benefit them both. He needed help with his children and household, and she needed a place to live. Perhaps they could come to some sort of agreement that would solve both their problems. The offer was delivered with careful respect, but Dorothy could see the calculation behind Brian's eyes. He wasn't proposing marriage exactly, but rather a business arrangement that would provide him with domestic help while giving her shelter and security. It was the kind of practical solution that frontier life often demanded, born of necessity rather than affection or desire. Dorothy listened to Brian's proposal with growing discomfort, recognizing it as potentially her only option, while simultaneously feeling diminished by its purely utilitarian nature. She had spent years watching other women find love and partnership, and now she was being offered a position that was barely a step above hired help. The arrangement would solve her immediate crisis, but it would also represent a final acknowledgement that she had moved beyond the possibility of being wanted for herself rather than for the services she could provide. She asked Brian for time to consider his offer, knowing that her options were limited, but still hoping that some alternative might present itself. He agreed readily, mentioning that he would need an answer within the week as winter was approaching, and he couldn't manage much longer without help. His tone was understanding but firm, making it clear that this was a business proposition with practical deadlines rather than a romantic courtship that could unfold at its own pace. That night, Dorothy sat in her room surrounded by her packed belongings, trying to reconcile herself to a future that felt like a slow surrender of everything she had hoped her life might become. The practical part of her mind recognized that Brian's offer was reasonable and would provide her with security and purpose. The romantic part of her heart, however, rebelled against the idea of entering into such a bloodless arrangement, even as she acknowledged that her chances of finding anything better were virtually non-existent. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Martha Perez arrived at the general store in a state of unusual excitement, carrying gossip that had the power to transform Dorothy's understanding of her situation. Stephen Turner had been seen in town again, which was highly unusual given that he had just been there a few days earlier. Even more surprising, he had been asking questions about Dorothy specifically, inquiring about her circumstances and availability. The news sent a ripple of speculation through the small community, with various theories emerging about the mountain man's sudden interest in the town's most confirmed spinster. Some suggested that he needed domestic help and had heard about Dorothy's skills with cooking and sewing. Others wondered if his isolation had finally driven him to seek companionship, regardless of conventional standards of desirability. The more cynical voices suggested that he was simply looking for someone desperate enough to accept whatever arrangement he might propose. Dorothy felt a mixture of hope and trepidation as she absorbed this information. The idea that Stephen Turner had been thinking about her was both thrilling and terrifying, opening up possibilities she hadn't dared to consider while simultaneously exposing her to potential humiliation if his interest proved to be less significant than the gossips were suggesting. She tried to maintain her composure as she went about her daily tasks, but found her attention constantly drifting to the store's windows as she watched for any sign of the mountain man's return. Her vigil was rewarded late in the afternoon when Stephen Turner appeared once again in the doorway of the general store. This time, however, his manner was different. Instead of the purely businesslike demeanor he had displayed during his previous visit, there was something more purposeful about his presence. He nodded to Wayne Hall, but made his way directly to where Dorothy was working, his pale blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her hands tremble as she tried to continue folding fabric. When Stephen spoke, his voice was quieter than before, pitched for her ears alone despite the fact that everyone in the store was straining to hear what he might say. He had heard about her situation, he told her, and wondered if she might be interested in discussing a proposition that could benefit them both. His choice of words was careful and respectful, but there was something in his tone that suggested this was more than a simple business arrangement. Dorothy's heart hammered against her ribs as Stephen Turner continued speaking in his low, measured voice. He explained that he had been living alone in the mountains for many years and had recently begun to feel the weight of that solitude. He wasn't looking for someone to simply keep house for him, he clarified, but rather for a true partner who could share the challenges and rewards of mountain life. His eyes never left her face as he spoke, as if he were trying to read her reaction to his unexpected proposal. The audacity of the moment struck Dorothy with breathtaking force. Here was a man who barely knew her, offering her something that no one else in 15 years had been willing to provide, a chance to be wanted not just for her usefulness, but as a companion and equal partner. The practical obstacles to such an arrangement were enormous, from the harsh realities of mountain living to the fact that they were virtual strangers, but the emotional appeal was undeniable. Stephen seemed to understand her hesitation and the magnitude of what he was suggesting. He told her that he owned a substantial cabin with good land, that he could provide for her comfort and safety, and that he would give her time to adjust to the dramatic change such a move would represent. Most importantly, he emphasized that he was offering her a real marriage, not a convenience arrangement, though he understood if she needed time to consider such a significant decision. The store had fallen completely silent around them, with Wayne Hall and the other customers making no pretense of not listening to this extraordinary conversation. Dorothy felt the weight of their attention and judgment, knowing that her response would become the subject of intense speculation and discussion throughout the community. The same people who had dismissed her as too old and set in her ways were now witnessing a moment that challenged all their assumptions about her worth and desirability. Dorothy looked into Stephen Turner's weathered face and saw something there that she had never encountered before: genuine respect and admiration. He wasn't offering her charity or convenience, but recognition of her value as a person worthy of partnership and love. The realization that someone could see her in this way, after years of being overlooked and dismissed, filled her with a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Her voice was steady when she finally responded, though she could feel the tremor of emotion beneath her words. She told Stephen that his proposal was unexpected, but not unwelcome, and that she would be honored to consider becoming his wife if he was certain that was what he truly wanted. The formality of her response reflected the seriousness of the moment, but there was warmth in her tone that suggested genuine interest in the possibility he was offering. Stephen's smile transformed his entire face, revealing the man he might have been before years of solitude had taught him to guard his expression so carefully. He told Dorothy that he had never been more certain of anything in his life, and that he would be proud to call her his wife if she would have him. The simple sincerity of his declaration cut through all the complicated social expectations that had governed Dorothy's interactions with men for so many years. The practical arrangements were discussed with surprising efficiency. Stephen explained that he would need to return to his mountain home to prepare for Dorothy's arrival, but that he could be back within a week to collect her if she was willing to make such a dramatic change in her circumstances. He assured her that his cabin was comfortable and well-stocked, and that he had been successful enough in his trapping and trading to provide for both of them without difficulty. Dorothy found herself agreeing to the arrangement with a decisiveness that surprised her. Perhaps it was the recognition that conventional approaches to finding companionship had failed her completely, or maybe it was the appeal of starting fresh in a place where her past disappointments wouldn't follow her. Whatever the reason, she felt more alive and hopeful than she had in years as she accepted Stephen Turner's proposal. The news of Dorothy's engagement spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from astonishment to skepticism to outright disapproval. Many of the townspeople who had dismissed her as an old maid now questioned the wisdom of her decision to marry a man they considered barely civilized. The younger women who had ignored her for years suddenly found reasons to visit the general store, ostensibly to shop, but actually to satisfy their curiosity about this unexpected development. The week that followed Stephen Turner's proposal passed in a whirlwind of preparation and gossip that transformed Dorothy's quiet existence into the center of town attention. Women who hadn't spoken to her in months suddenly appeared at the general store with advice about mountain living, most of it dire warnings about the hardships and isolation she would face. Their concerns seemed less motivated by genuine care for her welfare than by a morbid fascination with what they perceived as her desperate decision to accept any offer of marriage, regardless of its suitability. Patricia Hughes, Wayne Hall's wife, was particularly vocal in her disapproval of the match. She cornered Dorothy near the fabric display and launched into a lengthy discourse about the dangers of marrying a man who lived like a hermit in the wilderness. How could Dorothy be certain that Stephen Turner was even capable of civilized behavior after so many years of isolation? What if he turned violent or unpredictable once they were alone in the mountains with no neighbors to intervene if problems arose? Dorothy listened to these concerns with outward patience, while inwardly marveling at the presumption of people who had shown no interest in her welfare when she was facing homelessness. She responded to Patricia's warnings with quiet dignity, pointing out that Stephen had shown her nothing but respect and consideration during their brief acquaintance. His reputation in town, while mysterious, included no stories of violence or unpredictable behavior, only accounts of a man who preferred solitude to society. The most hurtful comments came from Cheryl Jones, a woman Dorothy's age who had married a prosperous merchant and seemed to take personal offense at Dorothy's sudden change in fortune. Cheryl made pointed remarks about women who were so desperate for marriage that they would accept proposals from complete strangers, suggesting that Dorothy was making a fool of herself by believing that such an arrangement could lead to genuine happiness. These criticisms stung because they echoed Dorothy's own private fears about the wisdom of her decision. She barely knew Stephen Turner beyond their brief encounters, and the life he was offering her would be completely different from anything she had ever experienced. The practical challenges of adapting to mountain living were daunting enough without considering the emotional risks of binding herself to a man who might prove to be incompatible with her nature and needs. But whenever doubt began to overwhelm her, Dorothy reminded herself of the alternatives she faced. Brian Price's offer of a practical arrangement still stood, but it represented a future of service rather than partnership. Remaining in Cedar Falls without secure housing would likely lead to gradual destitution and increasing dependence on charity. At least Stephen Turner's proposal offered the possibility of dignity and genuine companionship, even if it came with significant risks. Martha Perez provided the most valuable support during this difficult week, offering practical advice about preparing for mountain life while avoiding the dire predictions that others seemed determined to share. She helped Dorothy select appropriate clothing for harsh weather and rough living conditions, and provided insights about food preservation and basic medical care that could prove essential in an isolated setting. Most importantly, Martha shared her own observations about Stephen Turner, based on his occasional visits to town over the years. She had noticed that he always paid his debts promptly and dealt fairly with merchants, that he was respectful to women and children, and that he showed signs of education and refinement despite his rustic appearance. These details helped Dorothy feel more confident about her decision to trust a man whose character she could only judge from limited interactions. The wedding dress that Dorothy had kept carefully preserved for so many years became a symbol of both her past hopes and her current transformation. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, and the style was no longer fashionable, but she spent hours carefully cleaning and pressing it in preparation for her wedding day. The dress represented her refusal to give up on the possibility of love and partnership, even when that possibility had seemed increasingly remote. As the week progressed, Dorothy began to feel a growing sense of excitement about the adventure that awaited her. The prospect of living in the mountains, while daunting, also held appeal for someone who had always felt constrained by the social expectations and limitations of town life. She imagined herself learning new skills and adapting to challenges that would test her resourcefulness and resilience in ways that her current existence never had. Stephen Turner returned to Cedar Falls exactly when he had promised, arriving at the general store with a pack horse loaded with supplies and gifts for his bride-to-be. He had brought her a heavy woolen cloak lined with fur, practical boots designed for mountain terrain, and a beautifully crafted wooden box filled with small treasures he had collected during his years in the wilderness. The thoughtfulness of these gifts touched Dorothy deeply and reinforced her growing conviction that she had made the right choice. The morning of Dorothy's wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the ground and a sharp wind that promised the early winter Stephen had predicted. She dressed carefully in her preserved wedding gown, taking time with her hair and the small touches that would mark this as the most significant day of her life. The mirror reflected back a woman who looked older than the hopeful bride who had originally planned to wear this dress. But there was something new in her eyes that spoke of determination and quiet courage. Martha Perez arrived early to help with final preparations and to serve as Dorothy's witness at the ceremony. The two women had become closer during the week of preparation, and Martha's steady support had been invaluable in helping Dorothy maintain her confidence in the face of community skepticism. As they made their way to the small church where the ceremony would take place, Martha offered final words of encouragement and practical advice about the journey ahead. The church was sparsely attended, with only a handful of townspeople present to witness the unusual union. Most of the community had chosen to stay away, either from disapproval of the match or from uncertainty about how to behave at such an unconventional wedding. Wayne Hall was there out of obligation, since Dorothy had been living above his store, and a few other merchants who had business relationships with Stephen attended out of curiosity more than genuine goodwill. Stephen Turner stood waiting at the altar in clothes that were clearly his best, though still more suited to frontier life than formal occasions. He had trimmed his beard and tied back his long hair, making an effort to present himself appropriately for the solemnity of the occasion. When Dorothy entered the church, his face lit up with unmistakable pride and pleasure, as if she were the most beautiful bride he had ever seen, rather than a woman past her prime in a yellow dress. The ceremony itself was brief and simple, conducted by Pastor David Morales, who had agreed to perform the service despite his own reservations about the match. The traditional words took on special meaning as Dorothy and Stephen exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges their unusual life together might bring. When Stephen slipped a simple gold band onto Dorothy's finger, she felt a sense of completion that she had never expected to experience. The moment that would become legend in Cedar Falls occurred immediately after the ceremony, as the small wedding party emerged from the church into the crisp morning air. A group of townspeople had gathered outside, drawn by curiosity about the proceedings and eager to witness the conclusion of what many considered a spectacle rather than a genuine celebration. Their faces showed a mixture of amusement, skepticism, and barely concealed cruelty as they waited to see how the newly married couple would handle their scrutiny. It was Cheryl Jones who voiced what many of the onlookers were thinking, her voice carrying clearly across the churchyard as she made a comment about women who were so desperate for marriage that they would accept any man willing to have them. Her words were designed to wound, to reduce Dorothy's moment of triumph to an object of pity and ridicule. The crowd stirred with uncomfortable laughter, recognizing the cruelty of the comment, but unwilling to challenge it directly. Stephen Turner's response was immediate and decisive. He stepped forward, his impressive frame commanding attention, as he positioned himself protectively beside his new wife. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed, cutting through the murmurs and whispers of the crowd like a blade through silk. The words he chose were simple but devastating in their impact, delivered with a pride and conviction that brooked no argument or contradiction. "She's my wife," Stephen declared, his finger pointing directly at Dorothy with unmistakable possessiveness and pride. The statement was both a claim and a challenge, daring anyone present to question his choice or to suggest that Dorothy was anything less than worthy of his devotion. His tone made it clear that he considered himself the fortunate one in this arrangement, that he had won a prize rather than settled for a consolation. The effect of Stephen's declaration on the gathered crowd was immediate and profound. The same people who had spent years dismissing Dorothy as too old and too set in her ways suddenly found themselves confronted with a man who saw her as valuable and desirable. The laughter died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence as the townspeople struggled to reconcile their preconceptions with the evidence of genuine pride and affection they were witnessing. Dorothy felt the power of Stephen's declaration wash over her like a warm tide, erasing years of accumulated hurt and rejection in a single transformative moment. For the first time in her adult life, she was being claimed publicly and proudly by a man who saw her worth when others had been blind to it. The simple phrase carried more weight than any elaborate declaration of love could have, because it was delivered in the face of social disapproval and with complete conviction. The crowd began to disperse awkwardly, their appetite for spectacle diminished by Stephen's forceful defense of his bride. Some of the women who had been most vocal in their criticism now avoided eye contact, perhaps recognizing the ugliness of their behavior when confronted with genuine devotion. The men seemed impressed despite themselves by Stephen's unwavering support of his choice, recognizing in him the kind of loyalty and strength that frontier life demanded. As the townspeople drifted away, Stephen turned his full attention to Dorothy, his weathered face soft with tenderness as he helped her into the wagon that would carry them to their new life together. His movements were gentle and protective, treating her with the care due to something precious rather than the resigned acceptance she had expected from a marriage of convenience. The contrast between his fierce defense of her in public and his tender consideration in private revealed depths to his character that she was only beginning to understand. The journey to Stephen's mountain home took most of the day, following rough trails that climbed steadily away from the settled valley where Cedar Falls lay. Dorothy found herself fascinated by the changing landscape as they traveled higher into the wilderness, leaving behind the familiar sights and sounds of civilization for something wilder and more elemental. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying scents of pine and snow that spoke of the harsh but beautiful environment that would be her new home. Stephen proved to be a thoughtful traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the country they were passing through. He had an intimate knowledge of the terrain that spoke of years spent learning every trail and hidden valley, and his obvious love for this harsh landscape helped Dorothy begin to understand what had drawn him to such an isolated existence. There was a peace in his manner as they climbed higher that suggested he was returning to a place where he truly belonged. As afternoon faded toward evening, they reached a high meadow where Stephen's cabin stood in a grove of ancient pines. The structure was larger and more substantial than Dorothy had expected, built from massive logs and designed to withstand the fierce storms that must sweep through the mountains during winter months. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, creating an image of welcome and security that eased some of Dorothy's anxiety about her new surroundings. The interior of the cabin revealed Stephen to be a man of unexpected refinement and skill. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted, and the rooms were clean and organized with military precision. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and Dorothy was surprised to recognize several titles that she had read and enjoyed. The kitchen was well-equipped and stocked with supplies that would see them through the coming winter, evidence of the careful planning that mountain life required. Stephen had prepared for Dorothy's arrival with touching attention to detail. The bedroom held a new dresser and mirror, obviously crafted specifically for her use, and the bed was made up with fine linens that must have cost him considerably in trade. Wildflowers filled a vase on the table, their bright colors bringing life and warmth to the rustic interior. Every element of the cabin spoke of a man who had given serious thought to making his bride comfortable and welcome in her new home. As they shared their first meal together as husband and wife, Dorothy began to understand the magnitude of the change she had undertaken. The silence of the mountains was profound after years of town noise, broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant call of nightbirds. The isolation was complete, with no neighbors within miles and no possibility of casual, social interaction. Yet instead of feeling trapped or frightened, Dorothy found herself experiencing a sense of liberation that surprised her with its intensity. Stephen seemed to sense her mixed emotions and made no demands on her attention or affection beyond what she was ready to give. He spoke quietly about practical matters, explaining the routines of mountain life and the preparations they would need to make for winter. His manner was patient and instructive rather than commanding, treating her as a partner whose comfort and understanding were important to their mutual success. The first weeks of Dorothy's marriage unfolded with surprising harmony as she adapted to the rhythms of mountain life. Stephen proved to be an ideal teacher, patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise as she mastered new skills. He showed her how to read weather signs and the behavior of animals and the color of the sky, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter months, and how to maintain the equipment that their survival depended upon. Dorothy discovered reserves of strength and capability that she had never been called upon to use during her years in town. The physical demands of mountain living required her to develop new muscles and endurance, but she found satisfaction in the direct relationship between effort and results that characterized their daily existence. Every task had clear purpose and immediate relevance to their well-being, creating a sense of meaningful contribution that her previous life had lacked. The isolation that she had feared became one of the greatest gifts of her new existence. Free from the constant scrutiny and judgment of town life, Dorothy felt herself relaxing into a more natural version of herself. She could speak her mind without fear of social consequences, pursue her interests without concern for propriety, and develop her relationship with Stephen without the interference of outside opinions and expectations. Stephen revealed himself to be a man of surprising depth and complexity as their acquaintance deepened into genuine companionship. His years of solitude had not made him antisocial, but rather had taught him to value authentic connection over superficial interaction. He listened to Dorothy's thoughts and opinions with genuine interest, treating her intelligence and education as assets rather than impediments to their relationship. The physical aspects of their marriage developed gradually and naturally, without the awkwardness that Dorothy had feared might characterize such an unconventional union. Stephen's consideration and patience allowed her to overcome years of believing herself undesirable, helping her discover a capacity for passion and intimacy that she had thought was beyond her reach. Their growing physical connection deepened the emotional bond between them, creating a foundation of trust and mutual satisfaction that strengthened with each passing day. As winter closed in around their mountain home, Dorothy found herself experiencing a contentment that she had never imagined possible. The harsh weather that would have been a hardship in town became an adventure when shared with someone who understood and appreciated the challenges it presented. She learned to find beauty in the stark landscapes of snow and ice, to appreciate the coziness of their cabin when storms raged outside, and to value the deep intimacy that developed between two people who depended completely on each other for companionship and support. The spring thaw brought their first test as a married couple when Stephen announced that it was time to make their annual trip to Cedar Falls for supplies and trade. Dorothy felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about returning to the town where she had experienced so much rejection and disappointment. She wondered how the people who had dismissed her would react to seeing her again, transformed by months of mountain living and secure in her marriage to a man who clearly valued and protected her. Stephen seemed to understand her concerns without needing them voiced explicitly. He assured her that they would conduct their business efficiently and return to the mountains as quickly as possible. But he also made it clear that he was proud to have her as his wife and would not tolerate any disrespect from the townspeople. His quiet confidence helped bolster Dorothy's courage as they prepared for the journey down from their mountain sanctuary. The couple that arrived in Cedar Falls that spring bore little resemblance to the desperate spinster and mysterious mountain man who had left the previous autumn. Dorothy carried herself with new confidence and authority, her face glowing with health and happiness that made her appear years younger than when she had departed. Stephen remained as imposing as ever, but there was a satisfaction and contentment about him that spoke of a man who had found what he had been searching for. The townspeople's reaction to their return was a mixture of curiosity, surprise, and grudging respect. The women who had predicted disaster for Dorothy's marriage were forced to confront evidence that contradicted their expectations, while the men found themselves impressed by Stephen's obvious satisfaction with his choice of bride. The couple's clear happiness and mutual devotion challenged assumptions about age, desirability, and the nature of successful relationships. The transformation in Dorothy was so complete that some of the townspeople initially failed to recognize her. The nervous, apologetic woman who had lived on the margins of their community had been replaced by someone who moved with purpose and spoke with quiet authority. Her skin had been bronzed by mountain sun and wind, her body strengthened by physical labor, and her entire demeanor reflected the confidence of someone who knew her worth and place in the world. Stephen's pride in his wife was evident in every interaction as they conducted their business in town. He deferred to her judgment on household purchases, sought her opinion on trade matters, and made it clear through word and deed that he considered her an equal partner in all aspects of their life together. His behavior provided a stark contrast to the way many of the town's married men treated their wives, offering a model of partnership that challenged conventional assumptions about marital relationships. The couple's success was measured not just in their obvious happiness, but in the practical achievements that their partnership had produced. Stephen reported that their trapping had been more successful than ever, with Dorothy's skills in preparing and preserving furs adding significantly to their income. She had also established a garden that promised to reduce their dependence on purchased supplies, demonstrating an adaptability and resourcefulness that impressed even their former critics. Martha Perez was among the first to welcome Dorothy back, her genuine pleasure at her friend's transformation evident in every word and gesture. She marveled at the changes in Dorothy's appearance and demeanor, noting that marriage and mountain living had brought out qualities that had been hidden during her years of disappointment and rejection in town. Their reunion provided Dorothy with an opportunity to share some of the details of her new life while maintaining appropriate privacy about the intimate aspects of her marriage. The most significant test of the couple's standing in the community came when they attended Sunday service at the church where they had been married. Dorothy wore a simple but well-made dress that Stephen had purchased for her, and her appearance drew admiring glances from women who had previously dismissed her as hopelessly unfashionable. Stephen's presence beside her in the pew commanded respect from men who had once questioned the wisdom of his choice. Pastor David Morales used the couple's obvious happiness as an example in his sermon about the mysterious ways that providence works in human lives, suggesting that their union demonstrated the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize true worth and compatibility. His words carried special weight coming from someone who had initially harbored doubts about the wisdom of their marriage, and they helped establish the couple's legitimacy in the eyes of the more conservative members of the community. The most poignant moment of their visit occurred when they encountered Brian Price, the widower who had offered Dorothy a practical arrangement the previous autumn. He approached them after church with genuine warmth, congratulating Dorothy on her obvious happiness, and thanking Stephen for his kindness to someone who had been struggling with difficult circumstances. His gracious behavior demonstrated the difference between a man who had seen Dorothy as a solution to his problems and one who had recognized her as a person worthy of love and respect. As their visit to Cedar Falls drew to a close, Dorothy realized that she felt no regret about leaving the town behind once again. The place that had once represented her entire world now seemed small and constraining compared to the vast possibilities that her mountain life offered. She had found not just a husband in Stephen Turner, but a completely new understanding of her own capabilities and worth. The journey back to their mountain home was filled with conversation about the changes they had observed in the town and the reactions their return had generated. Stephen expressed satisfaction that Dorothy had been able to see how much she had grown and changed. While she marveled at the way their partnership had transformed both of their lives in ways neither had anticipated when they first agreed to marry. As they climbed back into the high country that had become their sanctuary, Dorothy reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had led her from desperation and rejection to fulfillment and love. The woman who had once believed herself too old and set in her ways to find happiness had discovered that transformation was possible at any age for those brave enough to embrace change and risk disappointment in pursuit of something better. The years that followed brought a deepening of the bond between Dorothy and Stephen that validated every risk they had taken in choosing each other. Their mountain home became a haven where two people who had been rejected or overlooked by conventional society created their own version of happiness and success. Dorothy's skills as a partner and homemaker proved invaluable in ways that went far beyond traditional domestic duties, while Stephen's strength and knowledge provided the foundation for a life that was both secure and adventurous. Their reputation in the surrounding region grew as word spread of the unusual couple who had found such obvious contentment in their isolated existence. Other mountain men began to seek Stephen's advice, not just about trapping and survival, but about the benefits of partnership and companionship. Dorothy became known for her medical knowledge and practical skills, providing assistance to travelers and neighbors who found themselves in need of help in the unforgiving mountain environment. The seasonal trips to Cedar Falls became opportunities to demonstrate the continued success of their unconventional union, with each visit revealing new evidence of their mutual prosperity and happiness. Dorothy's transformation from desperate spinster to confident mountain woman became a source of inspiration for other women who had been dismissed as too old or unsuitable for marriage, proving that worth and desirability could not be measured by conventional standards alone. As Dorothy approached her 40th birthday, she realized that she had never been happier or more fulfilled than she was in her mountain home with the man who had seen her value when others had been blind to it. The life that had seemed like a desperate gamble had become a testament to the power of recognition, respect, and genuine partnership between two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for. The story of their courtship and marriage became part of local legend, told and retold as an example of how love could triumph over social expectations and conventional wisdom. The phrase that Stephen had used to claim Dorothy as his wife, delivered with such pride and conviction in the face of community skepticism, became symbolic of the kind of devotion and recognition that every person deserved to experience. Standing on the porch of their cabin as another winter approached, Dorothy could see the vast wilderness that had become her domain, stretching away in all directions. The isolation that had once seemed frightening now represented freedom, and the challenges that had appeared insurmountable had become sources of strength and satisfaction. She had found not just a husband in Stephen Turner, but a completely new understanding of what her life could become when she was valued and supported by someone who truly saw her worth. The mountain wind that had once carried her trembling voice now brought the sense of home and the promise of continued adventure with the man who had transformed her understanding of what was possible. In choosing to trust Stephen Turner's unexpected proposal, Dorothy had discovered that it was never too late to begin again, never too late to find love, and never too late to prove that worth and desirability existed independent of age, convention, or social approval. Their story served as a reminder that true partnership could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances and that recognition of genuine worth could come from unexpected sources. In a world that often dismissed women past their supposed prime, Stephen Turner had seen Dorothy Collins as exactly what he needed, and his proud declaration of that fact had changed both of their lives forever. She was his wife, and in claiming her with such conviction and pride, he had given her something more valuable than security or companionship. He had given her the recognition that she was worthy of being chosen, valued, and loved exactly as she was.